In Romans 9, Paul answers the objection that it's not fair for God to blame people for doing what he ordained they would do. And Paul gives two responses. First is, who are you to say that it's unfair for God to blame people? And second is, the potter, it's God, is free to mold the clay, that's us, however he wants. And that leads us to ask, so in what sense do we have a free will? When we try to make sense of God's absolute sovereignty and human responsibility, we tend to be adamant that we have a free will. Fair enough. Everything in our experience confirms that our choices are genuine choices. But here's the problem. Many of us presuppose that because our choices are genuine choices, that therefore God cannot ordain our free choices. Otherwise, we may wrongly conclude God would be guilty of forcing us to sin. So some people argue that God does not ordain who will believe in Christ and who will reject Christ because he wants a genuine, loving relationship, not a mechanical, pre-programmed, robotic outcome. But that view contradicts what God has revealed in the Bible. It assumes a definition of free will that's not in the Bible, and then it explains away what the Bible explicitly teaches about God's meticulous sovereignty, which includes the eternal destiny of every human. So what are some analogies for free will here? A good analogy can help us make sense of complex concepts. And before I share some analogies, I'd like to first lay a foundation to build on. So a foundational truth here is that God, the Creator, is distinct from his creation. So the creator-creature distinction is it's fundamental to rightly understanding reality. So God created the universe, and he's distinct from his creation. God's not part of creation. And it's not as if God is like a gigantic elephant while we're like gnats. No, God is not the biggest, most powerful, most knowledgeable creature within creation. God's not a creature. The difference between God and not God is the bedrock for making sense of how God's sovereignty and human responsibility are compatible. So now we're ready for two analogies. I'll start with the terrible one and then give a useful one. Here's the terrible analogy about a girl and her doll. Some object that God's ordaining everything makes God unjust. So something like this scenario of a girl playing with her doll. So imagine a girl, I have 4 daughters, imagine a girl, she's sternly commanding her doll to stay on her bed. But then while playing with her doll, she intentionally pushes the doll from the bed to the floor. And then she scolds the doll, spanks the doll, bad doll. Well, that's a terrible analogy for at least 2 reasons. First, the doll lacks self-consciousness, and thus it's not morally responsible. And second, God doesn't exercise authority over his creation by forcing or manipulating. If God were within creation, if there weren't a creator distinction, then his meticulous sovereignty really would displace and remove our freedom. And that would make him a cosmic tyrant. But God is not within creation. God's not a creature. So now let's consider a useful analogy, a novelist and the characters in his story. So let's pick a story. In C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the character Edmund betrays some people. I won't tell you which people because I don't want to ruin it if you haven't read it. If you haven't read it, go read it. So who's responsible for that betrayal? Edmund or C.S. Lewis? Do they share responsibility? It's like 50% Edmund, 50% Lewis, 75% Edmund, 25% Lewis. No, Edmund is fully responsible and Lewis is fully responsible, but they are responsible in different senses. Edmund is fully responsible as a creature, a character in a fictional story. Lewis is fully responsible as the creator, the author of the fictional story. So Lewis, the author, ordained what Edmund, the creature, the character, freely chose to do. So Edmund has moral responsibility for his choices. Lewis does not. And that's something like what we mean when we say that God, the creator, ordained what humans, the creatures, freely choose to do. The creator has authority over his creation like a novelist has authority over his story. And God can do way better than write a fictional story. He can design the universe with complex characters who freely and responsibly choose precisely what he ordains. And by the way, If it offends you to be compared to a character in a fictional story, just remember the Bible repeatedly compares God to a potter and you to a clay pot.